Hi everyone, we'll wait for another minute and then we'll get started. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's good evening here where we are in Los Angeles. Welcome to panel 4 of our webinar series on Engage Research in the Asia Pacific region. Um, Before we start, we would like to acknowledge that as a land grant institution, the Department of Anthropology, Center for Southeast Asian Studies, and Asia Pacific Center at UCLA acknowledges the Gabrieleno Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tuvangar, the Los Angeles Basin, and Southern Channel Islands. We are grateful for the support of the Wenner Grant Foundation for Anthropological Research through the webinars on the future of anthropology grant, the Henry Luce Foundation, the New England University First People's Rights Center, the National Chenji University Center for Taiwan, Philippines Indigenous Knowledge, Local Knowledge, and Sustainable Studies, or CITIPILS, the UCLA Kotzen Institute of Archaeology, and the UCLA Asia Pacific Center. The UCLA Department of Anthropology, UCLA Center for Southeast Asian Studies, University of Hawaii at Manoa Center for Southeast Asian Studies, Ifugao State University, the Partido State University, and the Save the Ifugao Terraces movement are co-hosts of this webinar series. Panel 4 focuses on weaving in the Asia Pacific, specifically in Taiwan, Thailand, and in the Philippines. We look at how stakeholder engagement forefronts discussions on ownership and control of intellectual property or technology. In the case of the resurgence of weaving in the Asia Pacific, we see the relationship between heritage conservation and the impacts of economic forces. Traditional weaving in Southeast Asia is tied to cultural identity and cultural expressions. However, the assimilation of indigenous communities to the larger societies meant the cultural context of weaving has changed. The demands to produce textiles for monetary gain have also impacted the way weaving communities produce their crafts. In some instances, the cultural context of weaving has been lost. This panel provides examples of communities attempting and succeeding in situating their textiles to their cultural context. Panelists will also discuss how they are fighting against appropriations of their traditional designs by entrepreneurs through the establishment of locally managed textile commerce. Our moderator for today will be able to catch us mid discussion, but for now Professor Dawei Kwan will take over as will cover for Mr. Marlon Moynihan.
Hi, everyone. I'm from Taiwan. This is Naya. And before we begin to introduce our panelists today, I would like to share you a little of my thinking. Because last week we received a question from the audience. How will COVID-19 impact community engagement? And I've been thinking of that for a whole week. And I think the ban of travel, the constraint of traveling from one place to another, one country to another, is the most obvious phenomena we are facing. And under the phenomena, we have to stay at home or work from home. But I believe people will very quickly get bored and try to extend our connection and continue our work. So for the ethnographical study, I think the multiple sites or even international collaboration will be more and more important. And secondly, I also see that there is a crisis, the unequal power relations due to the gap of the access to the technology of communication and representation will be widened. The unequal power relation will be very possibly be widened if we have the gap of technology. So I think that's also the reason why we are having this webinar series, to foster multiple site collaboration and also try to build a network to support each other. So it's my honor today to introduce you our panelists. Our first panelist is Annalyn Salvado Amor. Annalyn is professor of anthropology and director of the Museo Cordytex at the University of Philippines, Baguio. She earned her doctorate in social and cultural anthropology from Oxford Cordytex Cordytex Textile Project, composed of an interdisciplinary team conducting research on textile in northern Luzon. Her research interests include non-West ethics, material culture, in her work in award-winning book. It's the award-winning book, Tapping Ink, Tattooing Identity, Tradition and Modernity in Contemporary Kalinga Society. She continued to carry out anthropological fieldwork among the indigenous communities in northern Luzon and have published extensively on the subject. Our second panelist is Nga Pin Ong. Nga Pin comes from Taiwan, received her PhD degree in education and master degree in ethnology from National Zhenji University. She is currently an associate professor and chair in the Department of Ethnology at NCCU. Her research interests include ethnic education, ethnic identity, experimental education of indigenous peoples, history of indigenous people, education policy of indigenous people, revitalization of indigenous language and culture, the museum's multicultural display strategy. She has been often invited to various workshops for indigenous peoples and new immigrants from Southeast Asia. In past 10 years, she has often served as a representative of scholars and experts in the Indigenous Peoples Committee from central government to local county and city government, and also a member of Education Policy Committee in the Ministry of Education, Taiwan. Our third panelist, Colette Crescent, is the president of the Kiangan Weavers Association, a weaving group organized by the SAFE, the Ifugao terrorist movement. The weaving group goes by the trade name Ifugao Nation. Her earlier volunteer work was with the Gabriela Women's Organization at the Manila National Office as a counselor on victims of violence against women and children. She is currently a volunteer heritage conservationist with SIGMO and also a member of the Intangible Heritage and Performing Art Society. She is also Satoyama Master, where she authored a teaching module, a step-by-step guide for students and teachers in learning how to weave. Poulet holds a BA degree in behavioral science from the University of Philippines, Manila. And our moderator today is supposed to be Malone Martin, but we are sorry that Malone is not able to join us in the first 30 minutes due to an emergent meeting. So I and Stephen will co-moderate the panelists in the beginning. And we have very outstanding panelists and very interesting topic today, weaving and empowerment. It's what you see here, the mask with traditional tattoo on it. It's also another example of the influence or the reaction of the community to COVID-19. So is this a commodity, cultural appropriation, or is it a reaction shows the agency from the community? That's very relevant to our discussion today. So we would like to welcome all our participants and begin our discussion. Firstly, I would like to ask our panelists, how do you define weaving as a researcher or as a weaver? And how weaving is important in present day? We have changing culture, changing cultural landscape. So in your community or the community you work with, why is weaving still important? So can we have Annalyn to start first? Annalyn?
Good morning, everyone. So I'll start with the first question because I'm part of this Cordytex project that works in Northern Luzon, collaborating with master weavers, local weavers in different communities. Uh, so the way we view weaving is actually part of the way of life of the people. It also forms part of this social biography for the people that we work in, and as many of you would know, this is also part of their cultural expressions of identity, and that's a continuation because it's part of a narrative of their ancestors. And then, of course, if you look at the designs, these features these different iconography patterns, which actually identifies a pattern to a particular group. Like, for instance, Ifuga have their own patterns, the Bontok group, the Kalinga, the Ibaloy have their own patterns. So weaving is really, really very important. And there is a very strong resurgence at this time. Can I show some brief slides about where we work for, like, for instance, the Cordytex project?
Sure, please.
Can you hear me? So we are this Cordytex project was conceived to work in different communities, and we have this interdisciplinary team from anthropology, ethnobotany, ethnomusicology, ethnomath, physics, chemistry, even ergonomics, economics, and geography. And we have collaborated with other groups because we view weaving as very essential to the different communities. And some of the master weavers have long been gone, and we're trying to revive extant textiles by reconstructing this one. So like I said earlier, this the textiles no identify that with a specific community. So that is very important.
I see a very interesting term in your slide, which is ethnomathematic. Can you further describe it?
The ethnomathematics, actually, we have a group of math professors and researchers who are looking at the different patterns on the textiles, because we have this assumption that in terms of cognitive relations, there is a mathematical ingenuity present in the textiles. This is not this is not about formulas or numbers, but this is about how designs are conceived by the master weavers, how they arrange from their mind and executing that on the weaving itself. So, in other
That's
words, yeah, in other words, the weavers are also very knowledgeable, and like I said, there is a mathematical ingenuity.
Yeah, I think that really, give inspire us that the weaving is a mediation for our education, even a mediation for the dialogue between our traditional knowledge and modern science, mathematics, for example. And yeah, that's very inspiring. And we'll come back to you later. But before that, Professor Ong, would you like to share your experience, including how do you define weaving and how, as a researcher, how do you work with the community, and how do you see the importance of weaving in present indigenous community today? Professor Ong.
Hi. Uh, I prepare a short film. Maybe I can share later. And we have since 2012. I participated in NCCU Olai Loga project. And this is funded by the Ministry of Science and Technology. And this project aims was hope to alternative development will be participated in the Olai area, and that transformation of the poor situation of the rural area will become its development advantage. And we have known the culture revival work of a group, the Weaver of the Ulai Weaving Association since the um, 1990s because of our long-term ethnological fieldwork there. And we also know the Ulai Ataya weaving culture is in danger. So NCCU University Outreach Office accompany those Ulai weavers, those curation and visiting museums in Japan and United States to find their ancestral fabrics, to understand the ancestors' weaving culture, and remark them. These actions allow the weavers to reform the Ataya cultural identity and inherit the skill of weaving. So, with the Ulai's experience in mind, and due to Taiwan's new southbound policy, I participated in another project since the 27th. So I go to visit the Thailand, and the cooperation Thailand weavers and Thai weavers together. So this so this Thai project um, combined, they will have a waving festival in the October 50th. So very interesting. And maybe I prepared a theme, so can I share with each other? I can share the link.
Yes, please.
Kaki，之前有给他们那个连接，有吗？Kaki有那个连接吗？
Maybe we sharing right now we can do that immediately. Okay, so please.
I can show the.
You can share in the chat box. Okay. So we will share that in the chat box, so we can have the link to access to the film. Okay, so all the audience can have the link to the film. And further, I would like to ask Professor on a question about since you've been to Thailand and collaborate with the weaver in Thailand and in Taiwan, can you briefly share us what do you see the similarity of the efforts between Taiwan and the Thailand indigenous weavers? Okay, so before you answer to this question, I would like to ask Paulette to share your experience in Philippines. Okay, Paulette.
上面
对，停止分享静音。
Hi, is Paulette here? Okay, maybe we can come back to Paulette later, but regarding to the question of the similarity of the effort between Thailand and Taiwan indigenous weaver, what do you see the similarity between the efforts of these two groups? Professor Wang.
Hi, okay. Because the Thai Olai's waving culture is in danger, and but in Thailand, the waving culture is still very activity. So they when Olai's weavers hope to learn the waving skill, and they exchange. They go the Olai's weaver. They go to visit Thailand, and they think they understand the waving culture together, and so they when they come back to Olai, they have a new idea to share their waving culture and to teach the young generation to wave, to learn the new skill. So I think it is a very good change idea exchange idea change.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. That's very important information. So, Annalyn, I have a question for you regarding to the case in Thailand. Maybe the reason that the weaving is very active, part of the reason, I guess, is because of commodified. I don't know how do you encounter commodifying in the case in Philippines, and also how do you describe the issue of modernization in that influence the cultural landscape in terms of physical change and traditional practice of weaving in Philippines?
Currently, for the last 3 years, there is a strong resurgence on textiles in different parts in the Philippines. For instance, in the Cordillera, there is there is government support coming from Department of Trade and Industry. There's the Philippine Textiles Research Institute, and also the research is done by the university, especially the Cordytex, who's doing research in the Cordillera and also in the Visayas. Now, there is a strong link between this. Weaving as a form of livelihood and also at the same time taking it as a value added part of commodity because there is a strong demand on the search for instance authentic textiles woven in different communities. So a lot of people are trying to look for what is authentic, no, looking for this idea of exotica uh, in different villages, no, where we can find this very beautiful textiles. So in terms of commodification, there is a strong there are two perspectives on that. One is on the negative part, like you view these textiles as, like you said, it's a commodity. But at the same time, we can see local weavers working on their textiles based on tradition, and at the same time, working with external influences like other catering to tourism, for instance. They weave for tourist needs, tourist demand, and at the same time they are also working at a household level, no. So they weave for the community. They weave also for other clients in other cities, for instance, or even in the global market. And what is interesting here is that commodity actually allows the weaver to innovate while working at the household level. So there's local weaving at the same time working uh, globally through the work of fashion designers, for instance. So they are engaged in that kind of activity at this time. So for me, the commoditization or commoditization of textiles, for instance, is actually a continuity of the story of the people. There's a continuity of the patterns, even there is a new form of materials that being used, from cotton to polyester, or using backstrap to digital loom, for instance. No, so there's a tension within that, but at the same time, what is unique about this, what's happening right now, is that there is innovation, no? uh, and then recognition of these local weavers in terms of their creativity and originality, and at the same time, there is also what we call as mixing cultures. No, so what they see as like a popular design in the internet or popular design woven in other communities, they also incorporate that in their own type of weaving. So there's a cultural borrowing and cultural mixing of these patterns to come up with a new design in the process.
I see. So not just a big company, but every household has the chance to participate.
Yes, the idea of household has for these weaving communities to have expanded uh, because they interact, they travel, they get ideas from the internet, they participate in trade fairs, so they actually see ideas what is done in other weaving communities uh, from the Philippines or elsewhere.
Yes, I see. So I have a question for both of you and Professor Hong. Do you see the tension between conserving the traditional pattern and have some innovation to meet the need of the fashion? I know because I read it Ifugao in 2019 or 18, and there was a fashion show in the community, which means that there are a lot of creativity in it. But at the same time, do you see the tension between conserving the traditional pattern and it?
Yes, is that there's a lot of ongoing fashion shows using the traditional fabric. Sometimes we get into a trap of this cultural misappropriation, at the same time permissive appropriation, because sometimes local communities would allow them, to use their own fabric for a particular design, but at the same time, there are textiles that you are not allowed to use for fashion. Some of the more sacred ones are kept, and they are not allowed. But sometimes there are textiles that can be redesigned in such a way that there is permissive appropriation. I mean, the community allows to use that for a specific pattern. The more common ones, or the textiles without meanings, or textile patterns without meanings, can be used for fashion, for instance. But again, we have to be wary, and we have to be educated on how these textiles are worn, how these patterns are used for certain ritual occasions in the community.
I see. When you say not to allow the use of certain pattern that has spatial meaning, is there any legal instrument or any mechanism to ban or to constrain the use of the pattern with spatial meaning?
There are some textile patterns that are accorded, for instance, for the dead. There are certain patterns that are accorded for certain rituals, which are taboos to actually use them for everyday activities. Um, but the problem with the Cordillera textiles is that sometimes we view all textiles as the same, but their iconography, or certain or specific patterns dictates what this means. No, so it is actually identified with a particular group, for instance, and sometimes these are held sacred by some communities. For instance, a blouse which is similar to the atayal, like the white cloth with some patterns, are used as funerary garb in Montauk. And then that's the same with, I saw that as a similar garment for the atayal. It's also used as a funerary garb. But sometimes, if you don't know what this stands for, then sometimes you would just wear this as an ordinary blouse for an outsider. So the outsiders should learn about this patterns, these textiles that are used for funerary blankets. Sometimes they're used for shawls or bed sheets, no, without reason. But to the shock of scholars, or to the shock of weavers, no. So it's important to understand what textiles are allowed to use, and what textiles can be mass produced for everyday things, or clothing for that matter.
I see. Ask a intention conserving the traditional pattern and adapting to the need and creating the new pattern of reason.
I think your signal is you had an unstable signal, and so you're oh, we lost you. Oh, okay. I think I'm going to take over. uh, Paulette, are you back? So, Annaline, the professor, or you're back, Daya. Okay, go ahead, please.
Yeah, but it's a good timing for you to take over anyway.
Okay, Paulette. I guess signal in Ifugao is unstable as well. So there's really this a thin line separates conservation, heritage conservation, and spectacle, and we need to think of weaving as something that caters to both the economic need and also the need to maintain traditions. Um, and as both Professor Ong and Professor Salvador Amores mentioned, textile or weaving reinforces ethnic identity, and authenticity is something that's for me it's a Western idea, that authenticity changes depending on who defines what is authentic. And in this sense, I think indigenous groups or people who practice the culture, who produce those textiles, are the ones who would define what is authentic. And for us who consumers of those textiles, we need to learn, or we need to know. It's incumbent upon us to learn about the messages of those designs, or the meanings of those designs. We had a question here for the weaving community, especially for Paulette, but I think Marlon should be able to join us in a few minutes. So we'll keep this question for now. And so for Professor Ong, a question that because of the OTOP program in Thailand, and so you have that income stream, and you also have that weaving tradition. How does it make how does this program, the Thailand program, uh, uh, develop into a more sustainable income stream for the community?
说泰国这个 project 怎么让当地的社群带来比较可持续的收入？
Okay. Oh, they combine with the tourist. They combine their weaving. They moving. They building a weaving village model. This is because I can. We mentioned about the weaving fashion show, but the weaving fashion show in Ulai only one day. So there are weaving classroom, and have a market, and have a weaving festival, and special pattern made in Ulai, like to promote the special. This is a new design, and compare with the Thailand auto. They because after the Asian financial turmoil in the 1997, the economic was severely damaged, and upgrading the rural local economic become an important policy of the Thai government. And after in 1976, under the leadership of the Queen Sirikit, so they building beside the handicraft center, and established by the Royal Project of Agency, which the prototype of auto department in Thailand. And this auto out of the department also happen in Japan and Taiwan, but I think that in my opinion, the Thailand autumn is more successful than Taiwan because the government helped to open up the market in addition to increasing the employment opportunities and the income. It promoted the Thailand's traditional handcraft and the agricultural industry and diversifies Thailand product to promote to the market to various parts of Thailand and the international market with cultural creativity. So I think this part, I compare the policy of Taiwan and Thailand. I think Thailand auto policy about the Wailing Village is more successful.
Thank you, Professor Ong. Daya, are you taking over?
Yeah, I have a question for Annalyn, because I'm still very interested in the multidisciplinary collaboration you mentioned in the very beginning. We discussed the ethnomathematics, and you also mentioned the ethnobotany, right? And you share us the information that you try to have all the household participate in the business or in the adaptation to the market mechanism. So in your opinion, how can weaving or how can the revitalization of weaving contribute to the development of indigenous community or indigenous society in different aspects?
The Cordytex, there's a recent declaration of Baguio City as one of the creative and crafts community in UNESCO in 2017, and part of this is to declare the highlight of weaving as a craft and an industry at the same time for Baguio City and the Cordillera. So recently, we just had an exhibition about this research findings of the Cordytex to include the anthropology of the textiles, how textiles are used. We included the work of our ethnobotanist looking at the traditional dyes of the Cordillera
I think we lost her.
Okay. And is Paulette able to join us now? If not, I would like to drop in another question for Professor Ong, because Stephen just mentioned that he think authenticity is a Western idea. What do you think about it? Do you agree with Stephen?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Because we also use the Western idea to do something, but now indigenous people discuss how to use their native idea to do their revitalization, cultural revitalization. So I think we have discussed about this.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. So,
So the bullet come back.
yeah, I'm just checking.
Mm.
So
Hello.
Steve,
Oh,
Oh,
sorry, I lost you there.
welcome back.
So
Welcome.
I think I can uh, stand for Paulette and Marlon and read passages on our recently published article on sapiens that uh, provided a background or that talked about the establishment of Kiwa, the Kiangan Weavers Association in Ifugao.
mhm,
And also some of these issues that we talk about on
mhm,
authenticity and the need for maintaining the traditions.
mhm,
So in 2016, I think Marlon Martin initiated a program with about 15 elderly weavers to use the Indigenous Peoples Education Center, IPED
mhm,
Center in Ifugao, which we helped establish. Initially, we called it the Ifugao Community Heritage Galleries, which was
yeah,
meant to spur conversations among the elders and the teachers and the younger generation about what they learned in school, what they learned from institutional curriculum, as well as
mhm,
traditional knowledge and recent ethnographic and archaeological research, because they tend
mhm,
to clash among each other. So
mhm,
we use the center as a venue to discuss weaving technology and to spur younger generations to learn about weaving. This established the Kiangan Weavers Association,
mhm,
Kiangan named after the location of the archaeological site in Kiangan. So we've been excavating in Kiangan. Kiwa
mhm,
members are obliged to take on at least one new apprentice every year. Within 4 years, since 2016, the membership of the weaving organization tripled, with younger community members joining elderly weavers to carry on the tradition of textile weaving. The center provides weavers with cotton yarn and market and sells the textile. As a result, what the weavers used to sell in Banawe, the tourism center in Ifugao, they earn about 250 pesos or about $5 on consignment. Now
mhm,
they earn at least 800 pesos, about $16 through the center.
mhm,
So weavers produce textiles that can be used for a traditional outfit, as blankets and scarves, or as fabric for more modern dress designs. They use customary Fugo colors of red, black, and white, but they have added contemporary iconography. So if you're looking for authenticity, then um, culture is not static. Culture changes, and so a classic example is this the revitalization of weaving in Kiangan, and I'll add some more later after some more discussions.
I actually do have some question for you, Stephen.
Go ahead. I'll try
uh,
to answer them. I'm not a. This is out totally left field of my discipline.
so I mean, I know that you start with an archaeological project in Ifugao, right? But the academic resources were kind of redirect to what the community need. The establishment of the Center for Weaving and Indigenous Knowledge, for example, right? And I think that's very positive for the community. Uh, but I'm trying to think it from another way. I mean, you are archaeologist. How can the weaving and establishment of this educational center help for your academic work? Or what does that mean to you for your academic work? That's really an important issue for engagement,
Yeah.
right? What's your opinion or your experience?
Thank you. So as our previous discussions, especially in the first panel, when I develop a research design, I make it the point that there is an engagement component. Um, Engagement with the
Yeah,
community.
yeah, I think I can.
Okay, there's Paulette. So go
Okay,
ahead. Okay, go ahead, Paulette. Thank you.
maybe we can come back later for the question. But Let's welcome Paulette. Paulette, can you share your experience in Ifugao in terms of weaving?
I think she's.
Yes.
But Annalyn is back, I guess.
Hello, I'm back. Sorry.
Welcome.
Welcome back. So,
Yeah.
so Paulette, I
Sorry,
think
have a connection here.
for Paulette, the question is about your role in Kiwa and also if you can briefly talk about the establishment of the weaving group in Kiangan through Sitmo. I guess no, not enough bandwidth in uh, Kiangan. So I'll continue what I was continue answering Daya's question. So in terms of, I'm an archaeologist, but I'm trained in the four field, and my research interest is really to look at the whole aspect of culture. So even though I focus on deep history, I focus on something that's it's probably esoteric for a lot of people in archaeology, but archaeology is really not that different from social cultural anthropology. So my engagement my engagement with the community, especially in Kiangan, is based on the need to involve them because of the findings of the archaeological project. All of us in the Philippines, almost all of us, are taught that the Ifugao rice terraces are 2,000 years old, and then the Ifugaos are representatives of original Filipinos. Like they were isolated, but that is not what the archaeological record shows. They were active during the colonial period, and that they were not isolated. That they were able to really maintain their practices because of their ability to shift their socio-political organization. And so as an archaeologist, it doesn't hamper, doesn't, it's not a barrier for us to work with communities. It's actually more, it's more important for us to be able to connect and involve the communities, because archaeology um, can either support or refute some of the basic history.
Yes, let's see if Annalyn back or not.
Hi, Professor Daya. I'm back.
Hi, welcome
Hi.
back.
Sorry for that. All right. What was your question again, please?
Stephen?
So what was your question for Annalyn?
I think it's about how do you avoid from cultural appropriation, but at the same time maintain a sustainable income stream. Because if we want to maintain the sustainable income stream, then we need to kind of adapt to the market, right? But how do you do this? Have a sustainable income stream and at the same time conserve the tradition and also, avoid from the cultural appropriation from your experience.
Okay,
Emily.
Professor Dai, I was mentioning earlier that UNESCO declared Baguio City as one of the creative and crafts cities in the world, and weaving was the highlight for this iteration because of this conglomeration of different weavers from the Cordillera. So they come here in Baguio to actually weave. And part of this one is the recognition of their skill for their skills, their creative artistry, and it is also a tool for action for sustainability. For instance, they can actually market all of this woven fabric in trade fair, in the artisans market, and also we have the an exhibition of the traditional fabric that was woven by our local weavers from different communities. So, in order to sustain this, the UNESCO could be considered as an entity to give this criteria of excellence. For instance, giving recognition to their technical expertise. So there is an indicator wherein you maintain a textile woven according to tradition, and at the same time it allows you to market these products to different venues, like I said, in trade fair. So here in the commoditization of weaving or the textiles themselves, the weavers are engaged in multiple economic strategies. No, they participate in their customary practices were involved in their weaving tradition, and at the same time with external transactions in the market. For instance, now, so in Manila, you have the hobby trade fair on weaving. We had the artisans market in Baguio City, and there are also local markets where these local weavers can engage at the household level, and at the same time connecting that to market overseas. No, so can we just show briefly some slides to explain this example?
Yes, please.
Oops. I think I hold on. I'll just share. Okay, hold on. Can you see the slides? Can you see the slides now?
Not yet.
Okay, so the Mosaic Cordillera is also a venue for a meeting, as a venue or a meeting for weavers to showcase their weaving. So we had an exhibition there. So all of this that you can see, the loincloth, the wraparound skirts are from different communities. So we as curators, based on our research, also share our findings from research in the field, and at the same time the research that we found on the traditional textiles of 100 years ago. No, so we bring that to the communities as a basis for revitalizing traditional weaving in the area. So you can see here these works of local weavers, no, as and the museum as a platform for showcasing all of this woven material. And we have the weaving implements there. We also collaborated with local weavers in setting up the exhibition in
Oh,
the Museo Cordytex.
I'm reading.
So here are the exhibition. So in other words, we see the work, we value the work of the local weavers in terms of the design, the materials, the content, and we recognize this as a very, very valuable art form to express their identity and artistry. Uh, and we do that for the Cordytex research.
I, Iken, Professor Salvador Amores, if I have a question about the role of communities in this sense, institutional museums in representing indigenous communities, and how are you able to ensure that it is the voices of the peoples that you work with are the ones represented in your exhibits?
Yeah, since the very beginning, since the conception of the exhibition plan, we already invited local weavers to be co-curators for the exhibition. So the Cordytex has been working with different communities for the last 5 years, and I think we built a strong foundation and trust with the local weavers, and so they feel comfortable when we bring them, for instance, fabric of photographs that we digitally repatriated to the Philippines and showing them images. There were also cases of there was also a form of resistance on their part, because some of them would say that they are not familiar with this kind of weave, based on the photographs that we have shown them from the museums in the US, for instance, or in Europe. And we encourage them to rethink again that there are these kinds of weaves that were woven 100 years ago, and these are from their ancestors, and just need to revitalize that and revive this practice, because textiles are part of their identity, their cultural identity. So for us, working with the collections abroad also is also an enabling experience to show the weavers that they can actually create more and revive extant textiles by using the samples and the photographs that we digitally repatriated. So in one community, for instance, in the Cordytex project, we also digitized some textiles using the digital loom. So in the digital loom, we actually deconstructed textiles, and we brought that back to the community to actually so the Cordytex team went to Norway to actually train in a digital loom using extant samples of textiles that can actually be deconstructed and rewoven to the digital loom, and at the same time they can do that using their backstrap loom. Now the digital loom is very new, and we do not want to replace handloom weaving. We just assist in the reconstruction and construction of extant textiles, so they can see they can also expand their 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 weave repertoire, or the designs that they can actually weave. So here we employed technology in reconstructing extant textiles in the community using digital technology. Now, many local weavers may have a resistance on this approach, but at the same time, it is new and it is accessible. And we received different reactions when we actually showed the product in the community. So this is the digital loom that we used. I wove this one using an original, essentially old sample. And this is the finished product based on this particular textile. So So this is the new trend in digital loom weaving. Like I said, we don't want to replace traditional handloom weaving, but at the same time to aid the local weavers to appreciate more of the original textiles that they had in the past.
So I think a lot of new technology will bring in and cooperate or co-produce the new pattern. And I would like to welcome Malone Martin for joining us. Can you hear us, Malone? Hello? Hi. So Malone, Malone, we did discuss some important issues. So I'm going to put all these issues together, and maybe you can share some of your experience or your response to them from IFUGAO. So we had some we discussed some issues, including how do you see the importance of weaving? How can the revitalization of weaving contribute to the development of indigenous community or indigenous society? For example, the generating the income or fostering the environmental education or enhancing the cultural identity. From your experience, how can it contribute? And the second issue is, as a commodity, how can weaving, to sustain the income for the community? At the same time, how do we avoid from cultural appropriation? That's the second issue we discussed. And the third one is, how can you make sure the community voice being represented or participate in the process? For example, we very often have the fashion show or exhibitions to promote our product to the market. We will establish the business for selling the product. But how do we make sure the community voice is represented or directly participate in the process? That's the third issues we discussed earlier. What's your opinion, Marlon?
Hi, sorry, but Paulette is having problems with her connections. But anyway, okay, about textiles, perhaps I can only speak for the IFUGAOs, but I think other indigenous groups would find similarities in how we are addressing all these different issues in textile production. First and foremost, we look into the function of textiles in one's cultural identity. In the Philippines, we have all indigenous groups would have their own respective textiles, their way of weaving, the overall appearance of their textiles, which makes it like a badge of identity for most of us. And you don't have two indigenous groups having or wearing the same traditional garments. So it's a badge of identity for most indigenous peoples. In the process also of weaving, it may be similar all over the Asia Pacific region, but there's always distinctness in how we see our textiles, how we put it into cultural context. Now, of course, we're having traditional weaving or traditional fabrics is losing to the bigger market of textile production because we have factory-produced fabrics. In fact, a lot of factories, the textile factories now can come up with imitations and probably better quality fabrics with the use of machines and with the use of modern dyes. But of course, the locally produced or indigenous, the production of textiles in indigenous communities would always follow this traditional process that represents their culture for one, and also how, especially in the use of natural dyes, where it's environment friendly, you know, and we're getting a lot of advocates now, you know, favoring fabrics that were, you know, they call it slow fashion. Now, the use of natural fabrics such as cotton, silk, or bast fiber, and this is more in consonance with, you know, taking care of the environment and better taking care of our natural resources instead of relying on industrial products. To most indigenous peoples, weaving is actually more economic than, you know, well, unconsciously also heritage conservation. Most of our weavers in Ifugao are basically still doing their weaving because they can earn from it. A lot of our weavers may not be very familiar with the meanings, you know, the cultural context of what they're weaving, but they know that they can earn something. It can send their children to school. It can help in their daily expenses. That's the reason why they're still maintaining their traditional weaving. In our heritage school, we have our Indigenous Peoples Center. We have a group of weavers. A lot of them elderly, but we are already having younger members who are teaching younger community members about traditional weaving. And also, the center is acting as an advocate in the promotion of our traditional fabrics, and also helping our weavers come up with designs that well, we may call them contemporary or modern designs, but that cannot be subjected to cultural appropriation, because we keep having these issues on you know, outsiders using our traditional fabrics into something else, which does not it's not favorable to the culture owners. So we've been having a lot of problems lately on this. And yeah, of course, it came up. They call it cultural appropriation. Most of our fabrics, our traditional fabrics, has cultural context. It has a definite purpose. It has ritual significance to us as indigenous peoples. But when it's used outside the ancestral domain, when it's used by non-Ifugaos, then it loses that cultural context. And sometimes it actually gets offensive if, like, say, funerary textiles are used as bed covers. They're used as sofa covers and as gowns. It's quite unsettling for us. So, but you don't always blame the fashion designer or the outsider, because they're not very keen on, you know, actually understanding the cultural context of traditional textiles. They just think that they're helping because they're buying. So it's also a responsibility, I think, of indigenous peoples to educate their buyers, so as for them not to commit any cultural appropriation. So it's a two-way thing. The weavers or the sellers or the owners of the culture should educate also outsiders on the proper use of their traditional textiles. And of course, we encourage, like what we're doing here at the Heritage Center. We teach our younger weavers to come up with more creative textiles. Of course, it's still basically inspired by our traditional fabrics, but it is no longer one, because, you know, once you modify a traditional fabric, it is no longer it's no longer traditional. So it becomes contemporary. It becomes a modern fabric. That way, if you sell it, the buyer can come out with anything out of it. So we also discourage the sale of traditional fabrics, especially those that still has ritual value to the Ifugaos. So we don't have to be complaining every time somebody uses it in another way. And so we'd stop accusing people of committing cultural appropriation, because in given the our market now, people just buy things. It's very rare for buyers to be okay. Let me understand the ethnography of this particular textile before I buy it. They just buy it. Especially now, everything is being sold online. So if they like, if they see it, if they like how it looks, and then they buy it. So you don't go to every single customer and explain to them the meaning of the symbols, the meaning of the colors. So might as well come up with something that is inspired by your tradition, but it's not, but lacks the cultural context. So we call this our modified Ifugao fabrics, and that's what we're trying to advocate to other indigenous weavers. Stop selling your traditional fabrics, so you would not be complaining about cultural appropriation. Because the production is still very traditional. The entire process is still very traditional, and that's what buyers want. It's not really how it looks. It's not because it is traditional. It's not because it's modern. They buy it because they like it. They like how it looks, and they also recognize the process. Back to you, Daya.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's very inspiring, and I also think it's very important to educate the consumer. As you say, that they might think they were helping, but they are not. So education, or educating the buyer, is important. Educate the consumer is important. So I have a further question for both of you and Annalyn. How do we educate the consumer? Is there any further idea or any experience of educating the consumers? But before you answer to this question, I would like to ask Professor Ong, regarding to the issue we've been discussing. Do you have any response or feedback to the issues that we were discussing? Professor Wang.
Yes, I agree. The text design, the need to interpret the cultural meaning of two terms, and at the same time, it is necessary to interpret and understanding the meaning of each two term, so that will not be wrong. So I very agree, Malone, to teach the customer to learn what the cultural meaning of every designs, and our local Olai local project also promote weaving made in Olai. So we also promote the education works. And another unsuccessful example is that the famous weaving diamond pattern of the Thai tribe is the eyes of the ancestors. I have a special experience once in the northern county city related MRT related activities. A meeting, they use the Thai Tutan as a footprint, and the print was placed on the ground for people to step on to indicate the direction. When I knew it was bad, and at the first grade, I immediately to respond to the organizer and replace it as soon as possible. So the cultural meaning education is very important for this. And in Attaya Tutan design, there is no obvious social class. So there is this control oversee in this area. But in Taiwan, another tribe, Taiwan society, Tutan have difference in family society, social status, such as noble and commanders. So some patterns on clothes must be verified before they can be used. So maybe in in IFGAO also have this problem. So we need to promote the cultural meaning education. Mm, uh, this is my opinion.
Thank you, thank you. That's very important opinion. So regarding to how do we educate the consumers? Is there any experience that you can share with the other communities? Malong or Annalyn, do you have any response to that?
Hello, Professor Daya.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So one of the projects of the Cordytex is to come up with instructional materials that can be used by teachers and their students and the weaving communities to understand traditional weaving. For instance, I'd like to share some slide of the instructional material that we produce under the Cordytex. These are storybooks on weaving from different communities in the Cordillera. We have the Apayao, the Kalinga, Ifugao, Bontoc, and Gadang in the Cordillera. And these are stories of master weavers and their specific technique that is identified um, to the community. Uh, is my slide shared already? Can you see it?
No. Ah, there.
Is
A
it
little
there?
slowly, but we can wait.
Yes, yes.
I think it's
Oh,
coming.
I was playing on my screen. I'm sorry. Uh, hold on.
Yeah, we can see it now.
All right. Can you see the slides now?
Yep.
No.
Yes, yes.
Yes,
All right.
yes.
So this is the different storybooks about master weavers in the Cordillera. So we have Apayao, we have Kalinga, Bontoc, Ifugao, and Gakdang. So these are stories of master weavers and their distinct design pattern or weaving technique that we highlight in the storybooks to educate younger generation, at the same time the consumers of these textiles, to understand the meanings and how they are produced. And we also produced in the Cordytex a learning toolkit on how to weave, um, using the backstrap loom. Um, and we are actually currently distributing all of these books to schools, elementary and high schools in the Cordillera and other communities, in order to encourage them also to document their own weaving tradition, and at the same time, if they know of master weavers that are worth telling to the world about this artistry and significant tradition and heritage. And of course, for us, for outsiders who are not really knowledgeable about traditional weaving, and of course to gain respect based on this stories, no, of complexity on traditional weaving. And hopefully the goal of Cordytex really is to incorporate weaving in the educational curriculum at the moment, especially now that there is iPad education or Indigenous peoples education. So we would like to really go for incorporating weaving in high school or elementary curricula. There are some universities who offer weaving as a subject or as an elective, like in it used to be at the Benguet State University, but it has been abolished. But there are some patches of some courses that can incorporate weaving. But at the University of the Philippines, at the College of Home Economics, weaving as a subject is also offered for students, no, working on clothing. So uh, it's a small move, but of course we're trying to get greater awareness, no, and appreciation about this particular aspect of culture in the Cordillera.
Thank you so much. That's very, very inspiring information. Malone, do you have any opinion upon how to educate the consumer?
Yes, because we have been we have been selling we are doing the marketing of our weaving products since 2016, and there's a growing demand of our customers knowing more about our particular textiles, which is it's actually a positive thing coming on the side of our buyers. So we try to in our labels, we try to do we put the short descriptions of the fabrics, though we cannot do it for more common products. If we are selling the traditional fabrics or fabrics with the traditional patterns, we would have to include the name of the weaver, a short description of the textile. In that way, the buyer can at least learn more about their purchase. Other than that, we are in our online store. We are having every now and then we come up with educational information about our woven fabrics. So we put a description of the traditional blankets or skirts or loincloths, and we're getting very good response from the public. So I guess it's helping a lot in educating or informing other people about the deeper meaning of our Ifugao woven textiles. And I see it in most products. Other indigenous peoples are also doing it, because it's also it actually enhances the marketability of the product. So if people get to understand more or see the deeper meaning of the fabrics, not just as mere fabrics, then they would be more enticed, or they would be more encouraged to buy from your store. So I guess part of selling is also educating, and we're making it more these educational parts. We're making it more user friendly. So and we do get a lot of inquiries from our buyers if I'm going to use this for a particular thing, or I'm going to sew this as a dress, is it okay for your culture? So we also respond to them like individually, but it gets very tedious, because we have a lot of customers, and it's almost we need to hire several people to answer individually all these queries. So we're trying to we're still in the process of coming up with ways of how to put a complete description of every fabric, especially traditional fabrics that we sell. There's been a big improvement when it comes to the use of traditional fabrics by outsiders, no? Because also cultural appropriation is becoming a global issue. It's not just confined to, say, the Philippines, but big fashion houses are actually getting called out for appropriating traditional fabrics of indigenous communities. So now everybody's getting aware of all these things. We also we have other collaborators like the Philippine Hobby Textile Council. It's a national NGO in the Philippines that advocates also the use of Philippine cotton and natural fabrics, and they also help in educating the public on the use of especially of traditional fabrics. And they're not just helping Ifugaos, they're also helping other indigenous communities educate our buyers.
Thank you so much. That's very important experience. And I think we can learn a lot from that. We are going to go to the section of Q&A. So we are going to, so that we can open to receive the questions from the participants. But, and I'm going to have Stephen to take over. But before that, I'm going to drop in the last question for you. Do you encounter the crisis that the younger generation are losing their interest to devote or to participate or to learn to weave? And if it happened, how do you try to make the younger generation to participate or to be part of the weaving action or the weaving industry? That's my question for all of you, and you are free to answer to these questions.
Hello. Thank you, Professor Daya. In Olai experience, Olai Weaving Association, young people, young generation are very important target of the association. And some young peoples are also daughters and granddaughters or daughter-in-law of members of the association. So the association let the young people learn to weave through course offered by the association and find elder teachers to teach younger one-on-one and participate in let young generation participate in other activities such as weaving festival, association stores, exhibition, and the course invited by the weaving teachers, video recording, etc. So I think the weaving, the young generation education is very important in Olai, and I will show a picture. This is the youngest weaver of the Olai, and her name is Sa Yun, and he also studied in NCCU, and he started to learn the traditional weaving skills. I will show the picture for you.
先打开刚刚那个 PDF。
我怎么打开？
老师传。
先传。Okay, and let me show the picture later. Okay, this is the picture. The young generation start to learn the traditional weaving skill. Okay. 那这样可以。
Okay, thank you, Professor Ong. Are you showing something else?
Yes, that's all. That's all.
Okay.
Okay. Thank
Thank,
you.
thank you.
Thank you,
So
Stephen.
thank you, Professor Ong. So for Marlon and Annalyn, the programs of the iPad Center and Museo Cordillera are definitely geared towards having younger generations acquire interest in these traditions. So there's still a lot of things to do, and I think we're on the right way, baby steps, but we'll get there. So we'll go into our question and answer now. Questions, and there's the first question from Tara. Uh, he is asking about entrepreneurs. So in Papua New Guinea, Chinese companies and entrepreneurs have been reproducing crafts such as bilum, those string bags, in large quantity, pushing local out of the market or marginalizing them. Do you see this happening in other Asian, especially Southeast Asian countries? Mass production of quote unquote indigenous products swamping the market and competing with indigenous people. So basically, like intellectual property infringement.
Hi, Dr. Acabado, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. There is aside from the ready-to-wear clothes, the RTWs, there is also well, at some point there is a mass production of
Okay, we lost.
printed textiles. Um,
Yes, yes.
all right. Aside from the search of RTW or ready-to-wear clothes and secondhand clothes in the cities and in the provinces, there is also at some point a mass production of printed textiles. This means these are scanned traditional textiles that are printed to serve as curtains, or for bed covers or for pillowcases, what have you. So when this came out specifically in the Baguio markets, there was a strong resistance with a group of weavers who actually resisted this one because it will actually affect their weaving, the traditional way of weaving. So at some point this stopped production, and the local weavers insisted to actually look at the hand woven fabric instead of the printed commercially used ones, at some point. So it actually affects, no, the local weavers in that particular industry. And we have to, go back to the traditional handlooms as much as possible, and we are doing this in many avenues to revive it. Thank you.
Thank you, Annalyn.
Oh,
Professor Ong, uh,
and
you know,
yeah,
Thailand or Taiwan or both
yes,
of those areas are
yes.
that you work in.
Yes, this hat see in Thailand and look like the Taiwan Olai Thai styles weaving, and this clothes should be made in China, and the tourist shop in Taiwan indigenous peoples often buy this from Thailand, but pretended to be made by Taiwan indigenous people, and original price is relatively cheap, but in Taiwan is very expensive. So I think this is the mass market problem. The same in Asia. Mm, that's my opinion.
Thank you. Related to this question of mass production, and recently there's a number of diaspora entrepreneurs, especially Filipino diaspora in North America, Canada, and the United States, who are selling the so-called traditional textiles. How do you think these immigrant communities in the global north would be able to ethically support indigenous peoples without appropriating textile designs? I think this is for Marlon.
Yes, it's actually becoming not just a problem for advocates, the anti cultural appropriation advocates, but it's also becoming like a problem for small weaving organizations and for small weaving communities, because a lot of buyers are getting afraid to buy indigenous fabrics because the fear of committing cultural appropriation. So I think there has to be some kind of parameter on how when does cultural appropriation accrue. Like I saw that that particular text fabric that is actually ulan from Taiwan. No? I saw that as far as Paris. I saw that in Croatia, and I see that in Banawe. So at the first time I saw that, I was thinking, oh, whoever is weaving this must be so rich, because you see it all over the world. And then when the last time I was in Taiwan, I asked one of our indigenous friends if the fabric looks familiar, and she said that's indigenous Taiwanese. And I was like, okay, so are you the ones producing this? And then we found out it's made in China, in the mainland. So, and well, of course, at the expense of the indigenous group. And now we're having similar issues with that, because we found out lately that our traditional designs, particularly the loincloth for men, is being printed and being woven in Manila. So that's how this one of a Filipino entrepreneur in Canada actually was called out by our young Filipinos in the States for selling so-called Ifugao fabrics, when in fact it was not. It's not even woven in Ifugao. So this particular designer actually reached out, which we highly appreciate her for reaching out to us and asking. Well, I think it's basically she doesn't know that these were not made in Ifugao. Well, she acknowledged the product because she came up with a line of clothing named, she labeled it Ifugao vests or Ifugao skirts, something. But she was actually using printed fabrics and also woven fabrics, but were not actually made in Ifugao. So is there cultural appropriation here? Definitely, because the acknowledgement of its being made of its being an Ifugao fabric is not enough to say you are actually using Ifugao fabric, because in fact she bought it from a merchant in Manila. Now we're not about to accuse everyone, all fashion designers who are making use of indigenous fabrics, as purveyors of cultural appropriation, because it's most of the time they're totally unaware of what they're doing. But the big fashion houses like say DKNY, all these US based fashion houses are actually being called out for using African ethnic symbols, for using American Indian symbols, which is well, if it's offensive to the owners of culture, then they would have to acknowledge that they made a mistake, and perhaps reach out to the communities on how not to commit cultural appropriation. So when this certain designer from Canada, who's also a Filipino, reached out to us, then so every time she wanted to buy something from us, she would have to ask, if she's going to sew it into a skirt or into a dress, would she be committing cultural appropriation? So, well, of course, it was a nice gesture from her, and we actually we opened this line of communication between our weavers and her, and then we told her that not everything that we weave would be like subject to cultural appropriation if you use it in a manner outside its cultural context. The bottom line for us in Ifugao, the bottom line for how not to avoid cultural appropriation is to come up with something that looks good, good taste. We had an issue recently with a local designer when she came up with they came up with they call it bahag shorts. Bahag in the Philippines, it's a loincloth, and loincloths are worn by men and not women. But they came up with shorts. They call it bahag shorts, loincloth shorts. That actually caters to women. They haven't modified anything about our loincloth. So it's like looking at a girl wearing a male loincloth. And it's an Ifugao loincloth, which is, of course, very offensive to Ifugaos. Other cultures who would not associate with that particular cloth would not, they wouldn't be aware that it's offensive to the Ifugaos because they don't know anything about it. So, well, we reached out to this designer who's based in Manila, and we told them that you're not supposed to be using our loincloth as shorts for women, because it's only the male Ifugaos who wear those. Well, of course, you can make use of it you can come up with a loincloth shorts, but not using our traditional fabric. We have this local superhero in the Philippines, Darna. You know her, Stephen. Darna is our version of a superwoman in the Philippines. She wears a loincloth. So we don't have any issue about women wearing loincloth. It's the kind of loincloth that you wear, because the woman in the designer I mentioned used an Ifugao loincloth to be worn by women. There's an issue there. As to having superheroes, super women heroines using loincloths, it wouldn't be an issue because they're not. They designed her loincloth to be more generic. It's not something that is associated with a particular indigenous group. So there's no issue with that. But if you make use of traditional fabrics in a manner that is contrary to the owners of the culture, then there would be an issue. So it's more of, I think we have to differentiate also the contemporary fabrics from traditional fabrics. To the Ifugao, you commit cultural appropriation when you make use of a traditional fabric in a context totally out of its cultural context. Now we have our traditional blankets, we have our traditional skirts, we have our traditional loincloths. We have blankets for the dead, but these are very specific fabrics. You don't just come up with any blanket and you call it blanket for the dead. We have like about 5 funerary blankets, and that's it. So you're not supposed to use them as a bed cover. You're not supposed to sew them into gowns or into dresses that you strut on that you used to strut on the walkway as a fashion statement. No, that's only for the dead. So if you use it, and especially if you're a non-Ifugao and you use it in a way different from its cultural context, then there's cultural appropriation. But also, our weavers also come up with modern or more contemporary fabrics that, of course, as I've said earlier, inspired by traditional fabrics, but no longer classified, as far as we're concerned, it's no longer classified as traditional, because it has no cultural context except that it was woven in a traditional process. So these are the things that we sell. These are the things that our buyers can use in any way they want. So it's not because you bought something from an indigenous community that it's already automatically subject to cultural appropriation. We have traditional fabrics. Most of our indigenous communities now in the Philippines are also weaving fabrics with contemporary designs, and these contemporary fabrics can be used in any other manner. So, because at some point, one of our young Filipinos who was going against this fashion designer told her not to buy anything that's woven from Ifugao, which is, of course, that would be much to the detriment of our local weavers. How are we supposed to sell our fabrics if you tell that if our buyers are afraid of committing cultural appropriation? So I think we are the fashion world is also in like a phase of transition into better understanding traditional fabrics and contemporary fabrics, and it's improving actually. Their consciousness, their level of understanding is increasing. It's improving compared, say, like 5 years ago, where any fashion designer can just make use of any indigenous fabric and then come up with anything. The level of awareness in the market on the proper use of indigenous fabrics is improving, and we credit that to the academe and our advocates, our community members, in helping one another in educating the buyer and educating the bigger public on the significance, on the cultural importance of fabrics that come out of indigenous communities. Uway?
Thank you. That's so that goes that there are several more questions here that response is related to two of these questions. So intellectual property is defined by the World Intellectual Property Organization, and this technology, this knowledge of designs, and how do we define what is traditional in this sense, is subject to arguments. But so one of the questions here is the presence of American Indian style blankets in flea markets, and that are made in China. It's a clear violation of the traditional knowledge symbols of indigenous peoples for profit. So intellectual property or appropriation is really associated with profit, and also with the use of so respecting the designs, the messages, the cultural context of those fabrics. But in terms of the work of museums, again, going back to museums as Western ideas, how do we link that revitalization when revitalization needs to be initiated by the community? So academics, as people who work in museums, have different perspectives, and perhaps we unknowingly impose these on the community, even if the community, quote unquote, revived the patterns because they were requested by the academics and curators. It might not have any significance to the weavers anymore. So how do we, again, because of the work of museums in conserving this heritage, how do we then empower the communities who are in need of maintaining their heritage? Professor Ong and Professor Salvador Amores.
Hello. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, the museum is a platform and also a venue for collaboration with the local weavers and the community. So it is the museum also serves as a dialogue, an exchange of ideas to develop their patterns. Based on the findings of the Cordytex, there is a need to really document the weaving technique, the weaving techniques, because most of them are transmitted through oral tradition. And this is the problem with documenting weaving tradition, because there is a scarce documentation about the process, about this designs and technology of weaving. They are scarcely documented. So the museum and all its allied disciplines, for instance, have to intervene to document this. The documentation will serve as a reference for the younger generation to replicate and revive their own traditional textiles. In the same way that it will also encourage it is also a motivating force and desire to protect all of these traditional patterns, and of course to enhance the integrity of these traditional designs. Of course, for the local weaver, one of the many questions that they have in mind is, why do all of this research when you cannot feed food for the family? So again, there's a need to produce or replicate traditional textiles, the quality of the textiles in the past with the present, in order to sustain the standards, the quality standards when these are brought out in the market. Uh, of course, for us researchers, there's always a need to have a continuous dialogue with the local weavers, what they want to do, and how they can actually engage with the communities and the market, and even in the museum setup. So sometimes local weavers also may have the skill, but they continue to weave, but it doesn't sell. So at the same time, it doesn't help the weaving community itself. So there should be the intention and the desirability to have to create good textiles, highlight good craftsmanship, and of course, even with new materials, they can actually uh, create using the same traditional technique. So that's a combination of, what I call as collective sameness, um, for them to be able to produce beautiful fabrics. And then of course that could be, it could sell in the market, maybe not, or you never know, or as an heirloom piece or an artifact is it exhibited in the museums. So there's a continuous dialogue with the local weavers. Of course, we do not impose as researchers, but what we do is to get this knowledge systematically documented for the younger generation and other future scholars working on traditional weaving.
Yeah, I guess we have 2 minutes. Do you have anything to add, Professor Ong, about the role of museums and
Oh.
initiatives?
Mm. Mm. Very very good experience exchange idea, and the Ulai Web Association now they preserve the attire weaving skills through teaching performers, research and the development in innovation, and try to reserve the traditional weaving patterns of Thai tribe in Ulai. So they teaching sales and the other methods do everything. So in the October 15, there will be Ulai Thai Weaving Festival. we are look for this, and they invite the young generation to be the curator. So uh, we will very exciting to join this festival and discuss with the waivers for the department.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So there's one, maybe just one more question, 3 minutes, and this is like Marlon and anyone can respond. And this is, I feel this is important. That the question is, it seems that there are a lot of initiatives regarding Indigenous community engagement that the speakers have been doing and have shared as to the weaving communities that they have worked with, that does not get to be articulated in research papers, or for me, I'm adding this, uh, for the general public. Is there a gap or a lack in the transparency of how your researches are being done that does not end up being published in the academic papers circling in the research world? If there is, how do you think should that gap lack be addressed? 2 minutes. Bert.
I think that I think
Go ahead.
that's more for those in the academy. But let me qualify. I'm a community-based heritage worker, and I also work with with our researchers. So basically, I've been working for quite a long time with on textiles with Professor Annalyn Salvador Amores with the Mosaic Cordillera of UP Baguio, and recently I've started working with Professor Ong on also on indigenous textiles. And I think, well, of course, in the academic world, we have publications to make every time you come up with research, with community researches. But also, I think basically the question is, so how do the local communities benefit from all this research that the academy is doing? Well, as for my experience as a member of an indigenous community and as a community organizer, it has been, there's a tremendous support from our researchers. Actually, also inspired us to do more research on our own. Well, basically, it's not research, but more of concentrating on textiles. Like weaving was not a major activity of our organization, but when we started working with people from the academy, and they have all this interest in traditional weaving, that's when we started organizing our weavers, who are also actually farmers. So it was through the academy that we were able to access earlier literature on our traditional weaving. Like, we've lost several sacred blankets of the Ifugao, but it was documented by an anthropologist perhaps 50, 70 years ago. And it was through this research that we were able to recreate this particular lost blanket. So you see, all these documentations, all these researches that people in the academy are doing can have long-term benefits, not only in the academic world, but especially in the community. Now, when we talk about this revived blanket, because we have been talking to a lot of our elders and asking them if this particular blanket is familiar, and they would say, it helps ignite community memory. So they're like, oh yeah, I saw that being worn by my grandfather, the grandfather, about 100 years ago. And then it's something that we are able to share to the younger generation now. And also our elderly weavers would suddenly recall, oh yeah, we know that blanket, we saw that when we were kids. Although of course it has lost its cultural significance to the modern Ifugaos now, it's still part of our history, and it gets more interesting for younger people to learn about their history if they see something that comes into life. They see all these material objects that their elders now, the elderly weavers are trying to recreate now. So a collaboration between people in the academe and members of the local communities. Working hand in hand is a big boost for conservation work. It's a big boost for letting the younger generations better appreciate parts of their culture, especially those that are slowly disappearing. So we also try to encourage other indigenous groups in our country, because we have this vast network of weavers who are actually indigenous weavers from as far away as Mindanao. We've never been connected in any other way except through weaving. Like when we meet the Yakans, we meet the Maranaos. There's like a common topic for them among us. If say in Taiwan, the first thing that struck me most when I was talking with some of their with the indigenous peoples in Taiwan was the similarities in our traditional textiles, same colors, same patterns, and you get more interested and somehow look for where's the connection? How were we able to come up with such a very similar fabrics? So it encourages us, it inspires us to actually learn more about our people, about the cultures of other indigenous communities. So it's all because of all these researches that people in the academy are doing.
Thank you, Marlon.
Thank you, academics.
Can I respond to it also?
1 minute.
Yeah. For the academe, we in the Cordytex, like I said earlier, are in multidisciplinary. So there are natural scientists there, and then you have social scientists. So to respond to the gap, sometimes the papers are too technical for like a physics paper or a chemistry paper on weaving. So what we do is to really have to convert that into a more readable format, such as we are having these storybooks and more manuscripts that can be easily digested using layman's term, and also using the vernacular, to transmit these findings to our local audience. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Professor Ong, Professor Salvador Amores, Paulette, are you still there? And of course, Marlon. The goal of this webinar series is to highlight successful collaboration between or among stakeholders, so academics, scholars, and communities, and we're happy to show the success stories. And so our panel next week continues, our series continues. Our panel 5 will talk about history and heritage. These are mostly archaeologists and heritage conservation workers. We're having examples from Indonesia, 2 in Indonesia, Bali and Maluku, Banda Islands, and then Thailand and Cambodia. So please, it's the same time, and the pre-registration information is on the website. Also, to those needing certificates, the registration form to request the certificates is on the chat box. And also, if you're not requesting for certificates, please complete the survey. It will help us continuously improve the delivery of this webinar series. So Mabalos, thank you.
Thank you.
Done.
Yeah.
Well, it turned out good, but Marlon was supposed to be the
I think that, yeah, we encounter a little connection problem in the middle of the panel, but